Thank you so much, Dawn, and thank you to you all for coming along on this fine afternoon. So I'm going to be speaking about stewardship as a model for open source governance, critical reflections, drawing on some interesting case studies in international law and elsewhere to think about how we can approach this new development in the Cyber Resilience Act and give it a little bit more context and understanding. As Dawn helpfully just said, I'm doing my PhD at the University of Cambridge. My background is as an international lawyer, and I'm focusing on global governance of open source software. I'll come back to that again a little bit down the track. And the work that I'm presenting today is actually a work in progress that I'm undertaking with Dr. Jacinda Singh, also at the University of Cambridge. The clicker is not working. Let me give this 1 second. There we go. Dawn, could I have a bit of help, please? Thanks. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Yes, so as you all know, we have had the Cyber Resilience Act proposed by the EU recently, which, needless to say, had some fairly mixed responses from the open source community, helpfully summarised by this clip from Little Britain in response to the first draft. The main fear was that the CRA, as the world's first legislative instrument purporting to regulate the software industry in its entirety, focused on cybersecurity standards, would be placing a disproportionate onus on compliance on those developing open source rather than those who are deploying it for commercial purposes. The CRA will be going into effect in 2027, and the final draft, as it currently stands, has attracted more comfort, but I would say from the open source community, but there's certainly still open questions and a degree of uncertainty. What will this look like for me? What will this look like for my project? And what will this look like for the open source community as a whole? So within the Cyber Resilience Act, it creates this novel category of stewards, and the definition is provided there. There's a general exception within the CRA for open source software, provided that it's non-commercial. And this category of stewards, I would say, is halfway between the general exemption and also between where open source software is being deployed for commercial purposes. With the steward category, it is ultimately light touch, quote unquote. It's a tailor-made regime. It's for legal entities encompassing foundations who are not manufacturers. And it's for stewards who are developing open source software intended for commercial activities, and also where they are providing support on a sustained basis. And under the CRA, stewards have a number of different obligations. I'll go back to that. They have to create a cybersecurity policy for secure development of their product, as well as effective handling of vulnerabilities. They must cooperate with market surveillance authorities at their request, and they may be subject to manufacturers' reporting obligations if they do constitute that role of manufacturers as well. However, ultimately, it's a very light touch regime, and there are certain obligations under Article 42 to cooperate with the relevant market authorities. However, as you will see from the text, if they fail to comply with those obligations, there are no penalties under Article 64. Essentially, this means that the stewards have everything to gain and nothing really to lose. They are in this like halfway hybrid category in terms of the CRA's remit, but also there is no risk of any kind of penalty against them if they fall short of those regulatory expectations. Now, the concept of stewardship itself is novel in the open source software context, but not a novel concept at large. In fact, it traces its roots back to the early 17th century in England, where the duties of the domestic steward in caring for the household's daily needs. Stig and ward literally meaning ward of the house. And in general, it means a custodial and typically non-proprietary relationship to a given resource or domain, often a mixed or common domain. Think the oceans, forests, air, etc. And international law has certainly been at the forefront of the development of stewardship, and in particular, their application to states. Now, stewardship as a concept has many different diverse forms, names, and appears across many diverse disciplines. It may, as a system of governance, often offer many potential benefits, but also drawbacks. What is interesting with the CRA and its stewardship model is it's happening against a general trajectory towards decreasing formality of regional and global governance bodies, as states increasingly delegate or defer regulatory discretion to various private actors, including in the digital technology sector. And this could be for various reasons, whether perceived or actual, such as resource efficiency, expertise, and flexibility. Thus, with this presentation, I wanted to do a comparative analysis to further principled understanding of what the CRA's approach in embracing this novel category of stewardship may mean for open source software governance, rather than seeing it as in a silo, as a completely random development. However, it's first important to note the limited explicit usage of stewardship in open source software circles to date. I recently published an article in the Computer Law and Security Review, which details this, as well as some general observations about digital sovereignty as it pertains to open source software. And there are a couple of examples where stewardship has been mentioned, but obviously these were separate to the development of the CRA. First of all, in Amanda Brock's book, who needs no introduction, she mentions the concept of stewardship, generally meaning the holding of open source code in public infrastructure. The Foundation for Public Code mentions stewardship but does not define it. And finally, the Open Source Way 2.0 has one undefined mention of stewardship in the following sentence: the Apache Software Foundation, steward of many of the world's most notable open source projects. It's quite clear that there are many implicit examples of stewardship already in open source software governance as an approach to governing projects, charities, repos, etc. But it is interesting that it has not had much of an explicit focus, especially when we consider the development of the CRA's provision. So in this presentation, I look at 3 different comparative examples from international law and elsewhere, taking in particular a lens of accountability and access. We look through this slide and the next slide at a couple of different factors why this could be helpful. There are different models based on the degree of state involvement. Is this a state-led initiative? Is it hybrid? Or is it led by private civil society? Is it a global commons or a public good, as open source software is often itself described? And what do these models mean for engagement with a wider community, stakeholder rights and responsibilities, and so on? So with the International Seabed Authority, that has a dual mandate to organise and control all mineral resource-related activities on the deep seabed, covering a mere 54% of the world's oceans, and it also has the mandate to ensure effective protection of the maritime environment as common heritage of mankind, words that sound very familiar in the open source context. There is also the Marine Stewardship Council, which is a very different governance model. That's an international NGO established by the WWF and the company Unilever in 1996 to recognise and reward efforts to protect the oceans and safeguard seafood supply chains. Notably, it does not receive any income from the certification of the fisheries in compliance with its standards. The fees are paid to an independent third party to do that certification process. And instead, its income comes from people using its accreditation logo, which if you haven't noticed previously, you will undoubtedly recognize whenever you go to the supermarket now, and you'll see the little tick and MSC approved on your delightful seafood. The final example that I'll bring in is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a piece of EU regulation responsible for the privacy of individuals' personal data in the EU. And under these relevant articles, it creates these private certification bodies, which may design and manage certification regimes under the watchful eye of supervisory authorities at the national level, who also re-accredits them with this power every 5 years. Importantly, though, engagement of civil society and people who want this accreditation is a voluntary process, and the EU is at pains to emphasise that it is available through a process which is transparent under Article 43 of the GDPR. Some key takeaways from comparing these different models were firstly that the MSC has decidedly taken a more voluntary nature to engagement with the public and also with compliance with its certification standards. As Richardson and Scherfel have said, such collaborative multi-stakeholder government systems may lend greater legitimacy and accountability than purely industry-controlled processes or government-determined regulation. And that is particularly evident that it is trying to have this legitimacy and accountability because if the public does not trust and like this organisation, they will not pay to have that certification. So therefore they have a vested interest in being particularly accountable and transparent to the public. By contrast, we have an example here of the ISA, whose funding and existence is not contingent on public perception and engagement. It exists regardless. It was established by member states and is generally regarded as not being particularly proactive in engaging the public. Several have raised concerns over the years over legitimacy, transparency, the dominance of a few member states, and the need for increased public participation consistent with human rights. Margaret Priest has also made the observation as it pertains to self-regulation, which is not synonymous with, but often overlaps with stewardship, that self-regulation is mostly likely to work when certain conditions are present. A history of cooperation, fair dispute resolution mechanisms, sanctions for non-compliance, and a role for public participation and oversight. When it comes to sovereignty and stewardship, a very interesting observation comes up for the CRA. Often these two concepts are presented as being at odds, with stewardship presupposing a community interest and sovereignty being more individualistic. But here in the CRA and more broadly with its digital strategies and policies, the EU is trying to embrace both at the same time. There are also, the stewardship and sovereignty are also non-mutually exclusive models. There can be hybrid examples where, for instance, a state designates authority to an international organisation or another body to be the steward on its behalf of a greater public good, for instance, an international organisation. However, as Duncan Hollis, a fellow international lawyer, has observed, what matters most is how the stewardship model operates in practice. And as you'll see from these diverse examples, this is very context specific. You need to look at the actors, their nature. Is it binding? Is it not? Does it have accountability and oversight mechanisms? Where is the source of funding? And so on. So what does this mean for open source software? I have a few observations in this regard. Firstly, for those who are keeping up to date with the CRA, many people in the community are expecting and hoping further guidance from the EU when it comes to defining the terms for stewardship and who would be eligible, for instance, if it is a legal entity, as it says in the text. In certain national jurisdictions, that might mean a natural person and mouth breather like myself and yours truly. And in other contexts, it means that companies and those who are registered with the state are only eligible. A question also arises of, shall the EU roll out the open source steward category to legislation beyond cybersecurity? Or will this serve as some kind of test case, waiting to see how compliant or proactive the stewards are, since there is ostensibly no sanction beyond public and EU disapproval for falling short of those standards? Engaging in this comparative analysis also raises a broader question of who are stewards and what does it look like to have this responsible managerial role for governing a digital public good like open source software. How and to what extent does it engage the broader public, including the open source community, dispersed, decentralized, and diverse as it is? It also is worth remembering that the CRA steward category is an EU category for regulatory purposes. That does not prevent open source software projects and initiatives from embracing the ethos and practice of stewardship, as many are already doing so. At the end of the day, the scale and complexity of the challenges strengthening open source cybersecurity is immense, as previous presentations have mentioned, particularly with the languishing of support and lack of investment in maintenance in open source. And I'm not saying that stewardship is some kind of panacea, but it may help to raise the bar and challenge key players to justify their acts beyond self-interest, thinking about what is in the common good and trying to work towards that. The answer may bear implications for better and worse for the future of open source governance. And finally, a plug at self-promotion. Here is a QR code which will take you to a very short questionnaire, literally a couple of buttons, and essentially feeding into my doctoral research at the University of Cambridge on global governance of open source software. With my doctoral research, I'm looking at what are the role of states, foundations, repos, various actors in governing open source at the global level. What are the key challenges facing open source software as a digital public good? And also thinking about the solutions. How can we, for instance, encourage states and other stakeholders to invest in open source maintenance, provide some other support? Do you think there is another role for the state and these other actors in open source governance? So if you could take 30 seconds to fill out that survey, I would be eternally grateful. And in the meantime, I've got about 8 minutes remaining, unless Dawn corrects me, to take any questions, thoughts, concerns, or sharing of existential crises. Thank you. Yes.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was very interesting, and I love that you're talking about encouraging this role that contributes to the public good. I have a concern that if I don't expect you to answer. If you did, it would be revolutionary. But it's about expert testimony. So, let's say I have this sort of different stewardship council that also protects fish, and I have sort of this mark, and customers. I need them to trust that mark so that they purchase things that I've certified. You were saying that it's important to sort of be accountable and transparent, and I think that's true, but really ultimately the thing that's effective is giving the impression of accountability and transparency, right? It's sort of a marketing thing. And so ultimately the more centralized the sort of, these methods for stewardship are, the more they're going to be done by experts, and the more the experts, it's difficult for them because they have expert knowledge. It's difficult to sort of justify to the consumer what exactly is happening and why we know that they're doing the right thing and not just having the appearance of the right thing. So that seems like a concern that's hard, but I wonder if you had any thoughts or...
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you do need that expertise in informing and developing these standards, whether it's for software, whether it's for fisheries, you name it. And the Marine Stewardship Council example, I find that interesting because they try and have multi-stakeholder engagement and consultation wherever possible, and there's also an advisory council made up of people from different backgrounds. So that's that in combination with like a quite active like public agency kind of promotional agenda is their way of trying to go about that and trying to say that, look, you come from these diverse backgrounds, we want to hear your thoughts and opinions. But ultimately, with the Stewardship Council, as with other examples on the screen, ultimately there were concerns raised about lack of compliance with human rights and other standards within the supply chain. So things do slip through the gaps, and it's a matter of finding that balance between centralisation and also effective outreach and engagement with these diverse and relevant stakeholders. Great question, thank you.
Hi. One of the interesting properties of open source stewardship as defined in the CRA, as I read it, is that it's a kind of a pick and a choose. There's a steward can decide, well, not only which projects to support, but also which aspects of it to support. Are they going to do vulnerability management? Are they going to do vulnerability management for everybody? There's a kind of pick and choose, as I said. Are there equivalences in any of the other stewardship models you've looked at for that, or are they generally fairly clear about you have to do all of these things or none of them?
I think it's more from these examples. They do all of them, but say the Marine Stewardship Council, it's developed by a non-profit in partnership with Unilever, and so they essentially set their own mandate, and if they fall short, then they could just change the parameters. As for something like the GDPR, if a private certification body falls short, then it's not going to be renewed to have that mandate for another 5 years. And that is a way that it will potentially lose revenue and also engagement with the EU. So it's like maybe they could do kind of like a half-assed job, if you excuse the French, with the GDPR, but they do still have that kind of interest in having the EU and the public on side. Great question. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you so much for talking through some of the complexities of the CRA and the timeline of the rollout, as well as kind of digging into, we're looking for more guidance from the CRA and the EU to kind of help define who and what and when are subject. Are there any references or guidance that you can provide that are more easily consumable, not legal advice, but by the average contributor? Because we're seeing some people have violent reactions to just the impression of what might come as a way to say, hey, there's a timeline to this, there's something that will come, read this and kind of sleep at night.
Yes, definitely. And I'll go to Lewis straight after that. I should mention that a number of people within this room and in the broader community are already working on this to try and have a easy, translated and accessible way of explaining the CRA and compliance. Shout out to the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, the ORC Working Group, which Toby Langell and a number of others have been working upon. And that is accessible on a GitHub page. They have a meeting every Monday to try and talk through some of the parameters. And undoubtedly there, as if the EU issues further guidance like that, will be available and you'd be able to have a look further into that.
I was just going to add that group met on Thursday, this past Thursday, and the biggest focus of the work was an FAQ. There's a lot more Qs than As right now, but that is maintained in the GitHub repo. So if you have specific questions, one, go see what's already there, but two, you'd be welcome to ask, and it's a good watering hole to get answers.
Time for one more question.
One more over there and at the front.
All right, you already asked one, so I'm going to give it to.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. Cyber Resilience Act was mostly about also having a CE mark, while the open source stewards projects will not receive the CE mark. Do you think that might have a negative impact on this, on the open source ecosystem in general? I was worried that if companies will start saying that, okay, in our procurement process, we will only start using software with CE mark, that would exclude open source projects. Do you have any thoughts on that detail?
Well, it's a fantastic question, and it will be interesting to see if people potentially qualify as open source standards but try and go like that extra level to try and get the certification mark as well. Like if there's particular benefits and if there's, say, studies saying that having this certification brings certain benefits or a marketability and trust from consumers. But I don't have the answers, and hopefully someone in the room will be able to have that answer for you one day.
And I was just going to add that as well as the great work the ORC is doing, the OpenSSF and the Apache Foundation are also doing work, and we're trying to coordinate that a bit better than we have been. So keep an eye on all of those and we'll try and work together.
Yes, exactly. So keep an eye out. Lots happening within the space. And thank you all for coming and asking such excellent and thought-provoking questions.